I watched the Broken Skull sessions with Seth Rollins. Almost 2 hours this thing went. And he was far more likable here than he has come across in past interviews that he's done or on social media. Some of the more interesting takeaways, he talked about his days in Ring of Honor as Tyler Black and working with Joey Mercury, who helped get him a foot in the door with WWE. At the same time, TNA expressed an interest in bringing him in, and he even agreed verbally to a deal after speaking with Dixie Carter on the phone. So he was waiting on a response from John Laurinaitis at the same time that he has this verbal agreement to go to TNA. He's waiting for Johnny Ace to get back to him and let him know if WWE has any interest. Jim Cornette finds out about this. He had worked with Rollins in Ring of Honor previously, and he also worked for TNA, and he knew what a shit show that could be. So when he found out about him possibly going to TNA, he called him on the phone and cussed him out and told him in so many words that that would be the worst decision he could possibly make. So now he's got Terry Taylor calling him from TNA, leaving him messages about signing this deal. Let's get this done, paperwork and everything. And he's ignoring him. He's letting it go to voicemail because he's trying to give WWE a chance here to get back to him. And eventually Laurinaitis did get back to him, and the rest is history. So much like Chris Jericho giving Eric Bischoff a verbal agreement to re-sign with WCW and then going to WWF instead, Rollins did the same thing to TNA. And that caused some awkward feelings when Terry Taylor ended up going to work for WWE. The wrestling business is very small. We love the wrestling business. We're all fans of it. I talk about it every week. You guys watch and listen, and we all love wrestling. But you have to also keep in mind when you compare it to other sports and other industries and other forms of entertainment, comparatively, relatively speaking, the wrestling business is actually very small. And you always need to be mindful of what you say to people and how you treat them, because chances are you're going to end up having to work with them at some point. Seth gave Cornette his props here on this episode. He did give him, a lot of credit for helping him out, even though he still has heat, he says, with Cornette over the comments he made about Becky Lynch last year after she announced that she was pregnant. I remember Cornette went off on how stupid he thought it was for her not to wait to have a kid when she was at the peak of her career. And at the time, Rollins was on the After the Bell podcast with Corey Graves. And he said it caught him off guard. Those comments were very upsetting from someone that had helped him and someone he knew and someone he respected. And he said it was unforgivable what Cornette said. But he still recognizes that were it not for Cornette, we probably would have had Tyler Black in TNA. And who knows what his career would look like right now. I mean, he probably would have been okay in the end. AJ Styles, Samoa Joe, a bunch of TNA guys ended up in WWE anyway. But is he there in time to be part of the Shield? Probably not. You look at the timeline, probably not. Does he win Money in the Bank and cash in at WrestleMania? Well, not if the Shield stuff doesn't happen. So it changes the entire course of this guy's career, his whole life. One decision. He talked about almost getting fired from NXT. Dusty Rhodes gave him some great advice, which was to just be himself. Don't let other people tell you who or what to be. Stay true to who you are. And he pointed out that as great as that advice was, it was a double-edged sword because it's also what almost got him shit-canned. I mentioned Terry Taylor. He and Triple H are very good friends. And Terry started working there, and Rollins would be in his classes. And he would question things a lot. He wasn't trying to be a pain in the ass, but he would really challenge him and push back on certain things, the way things are, the way things are supposed to be. And Terry didn't like that very much. And that led to Triple H pulling him aside one day, Rollins, and telling him, look, you're being insubordinate, and you could go back to Ring of Honor if you want and do things the way you want to do them, but you're not going to do that here. So he came very close to having the axe fall upon him. And same thing, if that would have happened, who knows how his career would have turned out. The pathway eventually would have led back to WWE, But the Seth Rollins that we see today would not be the same Seth Rollins had he taken a different route. He talked about the birth of the Shield. He never mentioned that CM Punk wanted it to be Rollins, Ambrose, and Chris Hero. But Vince McMahon wanted Roman Reigns, which was the right call. You look back on it, it was absolutely the right call to make. You have the high flyer in Rollins. You have the crazy brawler in Ambrose, the wacky guy. And you have the muscle. If you had Rollins and Ambrose and Hero, there's no muscle. There's no enforcer. The Horseman had an enforcer. He called himself the enforcer. You look at a lot of factions and there's always that one guy that's the guy you don't fuck with. Well, in the Shield, that was Roman Reigns. They all complemented each other so well. That's part of the reason why it works so well. And Rollins ribbed Austin about his segment with Rock and Hogan at the beginning of WrestleMania 30 going overtime. And then Triple H and Daniel Bryan went out there. They went 35 minutes in their match, which left the Shield with like 90 seconds for their match against Kane and the New Age Outlaws. Which, frankly, looking at that match, that's about how long that match probably should have gone. But he said, he was kind of ribbing him and saying, we only had 90 seconds in our match that year because you guys decided to go a little long in your interview segment. He said Vince McMahon wanted to break up the Shield a lot earlier than he did, as early as December of 2013. So with the idea that they would end up getting to WrestleMania and having a singles match with Roman Reigns and Dean Ambrose. And Rollins just said, well, I guess maybe I would have been the special referee or something. But as soon as he heard that idea, he said, yeah, that ain't happening. And they all pushed back against it because they knew that there was still money to be made from a babyface run for the Shield, which hadn't even happened yet. They had not officially gone babyface yet. And he's right. It would have been insanely stupid to break them up that early. As it is, I think they broke them up too soon. But at least they got another 6 months out of it before they killed it. And then he made a comment that I'm sure is going to ruffle a few feathers. He said that the Shield, in his opinion, and he obviously is a little biased because he was in the group, but he said that the Shield is the greatest faction in wrestling history in terms of producing top money-drawing stars and champions. And I don't really see what's so controversial about that, but everything pisses everybody off these days, so I'm sure that's going to ruffle a few feathers. But all three members of the Shield have gone on to be world champions both inside and outside of WWE. He said the only group that maybe comes close, is the Four Horsemen. But even with the Horsemen, you had Ric Flair. You had Arn Anderson, who was a great worker. He's a big star. Tully Blanchard, same thing, great worker, big star in his day. Same with Barry Windham. But none of them were Ric Flair. He said with the Shield, they were all Ric Flairs. I think that's the analogy that he used. I don't disagree with him. There really has not been another group like them. Of new guys with no prior history on television, coming in together like that the way they did on day one. In a main event position, they debuted in the Survivor Series main event. They attacked Ryback at the end of that match. And then their very first match was one of the main events of the next pay-per-view the next month, the TLC show that they did in Brooklyn. That was the very first show they ever did at the Barclays Center. And they stayed main eventers for the entire length of their run. They, together with Daniel Bryan, were the glue that kept Monday Night Raw together through all of 2013 into the beginning of 2014. And they all went on to be huge stars on their own. There's just no other group that can say that, where the members were not already stars going into it. I mean, you've had factions come together where some of the members or all of the members. Look at the Main Event Mafia in TNA. They were already main event guys. But you've never had a group like this with three relative unknowns come together and go on to the kind of success that all three of them did. As Rollins said, he wasn't trying to offend Marty Jannetty, but he goes, there was no Jannetty in this group. And for my money, personally, they're the greatest WWE faction in the last, decade plus. So he's not wrong. He talked about tearing his ACL at the start of the European tour they had at the end of 2015, and he had to forfeit the WWE title. He came back 6 months later, and he attacked Roman Reigns after his match against AJ Styles at Extreme Rules. And the crowd went ballistic. They cheered him like a babyface, even though the last we saw him, he was a heel. And this was also during a period where Roman was being booed still by a segment of the audience. Even though he was a babyface, Vince McMahon was just bound and determined to get this guy over as a babyface, kicking and screaming if he had to. And Rollins says that was a mistake, bringing him back as a heel because the people wanted to cheer him, especially after they had aired this great documentary for him on the network about his recovery and his comeback. He thought for sure that he was going to be coming back as a babyface. And Vince McMahon said, no, we want you as a heel. And he said it was a big missed opportunity. But of course, Vince McMahon did not want competition for his golden boy. He was trying his hardest to get Roman Reigns cheered like the biggest face in the entire company. And if you take Seth Rollins, who now is getting the reaction that he wishes Roman Reigns was getting, well, this is not the person that I want to push in that spot. I'm sure that had a lot to do with Vince being adamant, even though Rollins is 100% right. It would have made complete and total sense to go the other way with it. His mind was made up. He had his meal ticket, and fan reaction be damned. But after that Extreme Rules show on the sound off, I said bringing Rollins back as a heel is only fine if they do a dramatic double turn on the next pay-per-view, which was Money in the Bank. They booked a title match with Reigns defending against Seth Rollins. That's when Rollins won the championship because Roman was being suspended. Might have been the next day. He got suspended for a wellness violation. And then Ambrose that night cashed in right after. He took the title from Rollins. And there's another accomplishment for the Shield that no other faction in history can lay claim to, that all three members held the World Championship on the same night. The title went from Roman to Seth to Dean, all in the span of 5 minutes. But I pitched it on the podcast. Do a double turn. The fans would totally buy it and be into it. Do a double turn. Heel Roman Reigns against babyface Seth Rollins would have been money. Or even heel Reigns against babyface Dean Ambrose at that time. But they didn't do it. The next year, Rollins was a babyface, but he was stuck in purgatory with nothing to really do. After the WrestleMania program was over with Triple H, he pitched the idea of getting a run with the Intercontinental title. He said that was his idea. And he always loved it, going back to the days of Mr. Perfect, when he had the belt, and Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, how it was the workhorse title. He said he knew his work rate and his matches would get him over, and he was right. That summer in 2017, Seth Rollins and Braun Strowman both were the two hottest baby faces in the entire company. You could have had either one of those guys beat Brock Lesnar for the Universal title, and they went with neither. He talked about his match with Brock Lesnar at Battleground, where Undertaker returned at the end. That was to set up the SummerSlam main event in 2015 with Undertaker against Brock Lesnar. So he talked about the Battleground match. Seth had all of these ideas for what they could do. He claims Brock didn't even know about Undertaker returning until the day before. And he hears all of these ideas from Rollins, and he asks Seth, he goes, why do you want to do all of this shit? All the crowd is going to remember is Undertaker coming out at the end. He just wanted to tell a simple story and get to the end. And Rollins was crushed. He thought, how come this guy doesn't want to work with the younger talent? He didn't realize until later on that Brock was all about business. And he says it took him a while to understand that. Case in point, fast forward to their match at WrestleMania 35. Any other year, they're going on last for the championship. But it just so happened to be the year where Becky Lynch was the hottest star in the company, and the women were getting the main event spot. And he was torn because on the one hand, he's really happy for his fiancée. On the other hand, he's totally bummed that he's not getting that elusive WrestleMania main event that he still has never gotten. I mean, unless you count the cash-in, which he clearly does not. He said it's still a bucket list item for him to get his name on the marquee for that main event of WrestleMania. Yeah, I mean, if they keep doing these 2-night WrestleManias, he may get his main event one of these years. But the original card at 35 had him and Brock going on just before the main event. Second to last. Which, take it from me, having been in the stadium that night, that would have been a death spot for the two of them. So when Brock found out, he was like, fuck that. And he pitched the idea to Vince of going on first. And it was only about an hour or so before the show that the call was made to open the show with the Universal title match. You know, his attitude was, if you're not on last, you're on first. And it was the right call. He said he had a bucket of Coors Light waiting for Brock in his dressing room after the match because that's Brock's favorite. And they bonded for a little bit in the back after the match. And yes, they did talk about that match with The Fiend at Hell in a Cell. Austin pointed out that it won Worst Match of the Year honors in 2019, an honor that Austin himself has won. And when Rollins asked, according to whom? Austin didn't want to say Meltzer's name, but he did mention The Observer. I forgot if he said The Observer or The Observer guy, but he said The Observer, and they toasted to both being the worst match of the year. Now for Austin, it was the scaffold match that he had, tagging with Terry Taylor against PN News and Bobby Eaton. That truly is, if you've never seen it, that truly is one of the most god-awful matches that you will ever see. From Great American Bash 1991, so you can bring it up on the network and watch it. I believe it was Austin's pay-per-view debut. The scaffold in that match that they used is so narrow. I mean, I get the shakes just watching it, and I'm sitting in my room, you know, on the couch watching that. And if you're afraid of heights, I mean, I don't know. I don't think you could pay me enough, frankly, to go up there and do a match like that. But you could barely move. The platform was so narrow. And, I mean, there's nothing more exciting than a bunch of guys who are clearly scared to death of falling to their doom and just barely moving. Moving in slow motion. Oh, how exciting. How exciting. The scaffold match is one of the dumbest match stipulations ever created. I'll die on that hill. I'll die on that hill. Some people like their certain types of matches. Some people like deathmatch wrestling. Some people like scaffold matches. I think scaffold matches are absolute garbage. I don't see what's exciting about them. I mean, we know what's exciting about them. All it is, who's going to fall? That's what it is. Who's going to fall or be thrown off the scaffold? But you got to have a match before you do that. As a match, it is absolutely the worst, dirt worst stipulation. I've never seen a scaffold match that I thought, man, that was a great match. You know, of course, we all know what happened to Jim Cornette in that one scaffold match, where Big Bubba didn't catch him. But to be fair, I mean, it was a dumb idea to begin with, and that's how Cornette blew out his knees. But I just think scaffold matches are incredibly stupid. But anyway, Rollins says his vision for the match with The Fiend was very different than what he was told to go out there and do. And as the match was going on and the boos were getting louder and louder, he knew how much the match sucked. And he was powerless to do anything about it because his boss told him this is how it has to be done, and that's what he went out there and did. And he said when he got back through the curtain, he was so infuriated. He wanted to strangle Vince McMahon. And Bray Wyatt responded to a headline about this on Twitter, saying, "Wait until you hear my reaction." Oh boy. I can't wait for that shoot interview. That's going to be interesting. But Rollins says that he had to be physically restrained by Tyson Kidd in the gorilla position from doing something that he would have regretted. He and Vince McMahon, they locked eyes. They were staring a hole at each other. And eventually, and they didn't say anything. There were no words exchanged. They were just staring at each other. And eventually Vince, he probably realized, you know what, it's time to diffuse this situation. He just got up and he left. And Rollins said after he calmed down 24 hours later, they had a civil conversation about things. But he is convinced that had he been able to go out there and do what he wanted to do, and I don't know what ideas The Fiend may have had, because Bray is known to be a creative guy, and I'm sure he had his own ideas for how that match should go. That was The Fiend's very first championship match, and it came a lot earlier, frankly, than it should have. They painted themselves into a real corner with that match. But he says had he been able to go out there and do what he wanted to do, the match would not have won Worst Match of the Year honors. But he never got into what those plans were. He didn't tell us what that was or what that would have been. Anything other than The Fiend winning the championship would have been a terrible idea, which is why that match probably shouldn't have happened to begin with. But I'm glad he can admit that the match was a disgrace. Sean Waltman still hasn't been invited back for another watch-along since then. I don't think he's done a single watch-along for WWE on any of their channels since his reaction to the post-match. The post-match reaction from Sean Waltman to that is always something I bring it up on YouTube every now and then, and he's asking the same questions all of us were asking. How do you have a disqualification in a Hell in a Cell? Even though I don't believe it was a disqualification, but at the moment, that's what everybody was, and whatever you want to call it. Call it a disqualification or a no contest or whatever. It was a shit finish to a shit match. Everybody knew it, including at least one of the people who were actually involved in the match. That was the first night that I can remember hearing chants of AEW at a WWE show. They talked about the Drip God stuff that he's doing now and how it was Becky's idea for him to start wearing the wacky suits. And they talked about his Black and Brave wrestling school and how it all came about and a bunch of coffee shops that he owns. He's quite the entrepreneur, is Seth Rollins. If anything surprised me about this, it was how open and how often he spoke about second-guessing some of Vince McMahon's creative decisions. It was very striking to me how often his thoughts mirrored the same thoughts that I've had. And that I had at the time that all of this was going on. The same time that people like Rollins and others would say that all the fans do and all these podcasters, all they do is complain. All they do are a bunch of negative Nancys. And meanwhile, sometimes you have to wait a few years, but invariably, we end up finding out that in a lot of these situations, not all, but in a lot of these situations, these people were thinking the exact same fucking thing, and they were a bunch of hypocrites. But they were working for the company at the time. I get it. I mean, I understand why they felt tight-lipped, couldn't say anything. They have to keep their mouths shut because it's their boss. It's the guy who signs their paychecks, and you're not going to publicly berate your boss unless you want to be out of a job. But that's your Broken Skull Sessions recap.